All right, we are back with a new video, and it is finally time to begin our coverage of Survivor 42. And I've been kind of sitting on this for a while. I know the cast came out a couple weeks ago. I know that interviews have been coming out. I've been doing my best to keep up, learn about the different people on this cast, and getting excited in general. And now we're less than 1 week away from the start of the season, and it is finally time to give my preseason power ranking for the season. Now, as I do with a lot of these other preseason power rankings, I'm going to be ranking these 18 players by how likely I think it is that they'll win the game based on my general sense of what they'll be as players, as well as the potential that they demonstrate through their bios and interviews. And I'll say up front that I think this cast is very interesting. I don't think there's as clear of a front runner from this preseason as some other seasons where I feel like while there are a couple contenders that I feel like could emerge, I feel like there's a lot of people who have a decent amount of variance in their game or a decent amount of flaws that make me a bit suspicious about their overall performance in the game. But I'm going to do my best to break down what my thoughts are on these people going in. But let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the list. So, starting at the list at number 18, the player I think has the worst chance of winning based solely on the preseason is Jonathan. And Jonathan's an interesting cat. So, he appears to be the most physical person on this cast, holding the world record for pull ups, which I didn't know was a thing, but there's that. He talks a lot about his athleticism in his bio, from saying he'll play like Ozzy to saying how his challenge strength will help him win the game. And all this stuff is tempting me to just write him off. And these are not good answers by any stretch of the imagination, and not how you want to approach the game. Now, initially, I did think that he could have just been playing up his character, but after listening to his interview, I feel like this is who he is. And I didn't love the way that he talked. I mean, he's sort of this like low speaking person that has a lot of pauses, almost kind of like how I speak to a certain extent, which is something. So I don't think this guy is doing particularly well. Now, I don't think he'll be the first boot necessarily. I think he will be used for his challenge strength early on in the game. But by the merge, there's no way that this guy isn't being targeted, in my opinion. I know that I said that about Danny last season, but I feel like Jonathan has a lot less awareness than Danny did. And through that, I'm not as willing to say he has that potential. Now, could he prove me wrong? Of course he can. I mean, all these people have the potential to prove me wrong. But I think based solely off the interviews and the bios that we've gotten during the preseason, I had to put Jonathan here at number 18. Now we're moving on to number 17, and we're about to enter a string of players that I would consider high variance. I feel like these people have the potential to make a deep run, but they also have quite a bit of potential to be early boots. And at number 17, we have someone who is probably leaning towards being an early boot, but even if they make it further, I doubt how far they're actually going to make it. And here we have Jackson. And I find it interesting that he said the player Jackson is most like is Elaine, because the first person I thought of when reading his bio was Kyle Jason from Co Wrong, this big physical guy with a seemingly tough exterior, but is very soft on the inside. And I think that definitely came out a bit more in his interview, where he does talk quite a bit about his soft side. He's the first openly transgender player on the show, which I think is pretty cool. Again, I feel pretty good listening to him. He definitely seems like a nice person. And despite being one of the older players, he seems to be on the stronger side physically, just looking at his body type. And I think that could help him in the game. But even so, I don't know if he has that killer instinct to make the moves he needs to make. I mean, he doesn't seem like one of the more strategic people on the cast. And again, while he could prove me wrong, I think he's not going to be as aggressive as he probably needs to be. And along those lines, I think he has the potential to be an early boot, not because he's just physical weakness, but because I'm not really sure how useful he'll be viewed as an ally. I mean, I could very well see him becoming like the genie of his tribe from Survivor 41, where people like him and people see him as nice, but they don't really see him as that useful as an ally. Mind you, I think Jackson is more strategic than Genie, but even then, it's going to be interesting to see how he fits in with the rest of the tribe, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's an early boot. But even if he makes a deeper run, it's hard to say that he gets all the way to the end without being targeted as a threat. I mean, he literally cite someone that was targeted as a physical threat later on. So that's not giving me the best sense in the world. And because of that, I have Jackson here at number 17. Now we're moving on to number 16, and we have another pretty high variance player. And here we have Jenny. And Jenny's interesting. She's one of the older people on the cast. And admittedly, I feel like she's more likely to be an early boot than Jackson is. But the reason I have her higher is that I think there's a chance that she can make a deep run without being targeted. Also, I have more confidence in Jenny strategically than Jackson. Now, I don't have the best sense that she'll integrate super well into the tribe socially. I mean, while her Pilates background makes me think she'll be fine enough physically, I don't know if it'll be enough to make people want to keep her around. But again, I've seen people like her be able to find their way in, maybe struggle a bit at first, but then find their footing. And I think there are definitely people on her tribe that she could bond with, particularly with Mike. And I think she could definitely be viewed as an ally in her own right. But the other thing that I didn't particularly like from her interview was she was talking a lot in her interview about how in her previous job at in a corporate setting, she would come in and tell people what to do. And to me, that doesn't sound like the best type of skill set to have, where obviously you can't just go in and boss people around or tell people what they're doing wrong right off the bat. So that's not giving me the best vibe in the world. But again, there's at least a chance that she could, like move past that and really be surprising. Do I see that in her? Not for the time being. So for now, I have to leave her here at number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and we have a very interesting person to talk about. And here we have Daniel. And for me, Daniel is interesting because he reminds me a lot of myself, particularly in the way that he talks. He looks and sounds rather awkward, which probably isn't the best sign. And I guess this sort of speaks to how I think I would do if I ever played Survivor, which probably isn't that good. I mean, and that carries over into his Mike Bloom interview where he throws in a number of self deprecating comments regarding his own ability in the game. So he's at least somewhat aware that he is someone who's a bit more awkward and a bit more goofy. And again, it's good that he knows that, but I don't know how much it'll actually help him in the game. I also think that he'll struggle to build meaningful bonds that will carry him far into the game, potentially making him an early boot. Mind you, I think I'm higher on him than I was when I first saw him. I mean, I think when I first read his bio, I was very low on him. But I think after hearing him talk a bit more, I'm a bit more confident in him on the whole, but he's still very high variance, I think, where he has a very high likelihood of being an early boot, in my opinion. But if he's able to get past that, if he's able to build bonds with people, then I think he could be in it for the long haul. I think he is sort of the epitome of this high variance player, in my opinion. And he is definitely someone that I'm going to be looking out for personally because, again, he reminds me a lot of myself. I think he is someone who kind of represents how I might do or come off if I were to ever play Survivor. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's still very hard to tell. I mean, the best way I could describe him really is that he's a slightly more self aware version of Jacob Derwin, which probably isn't the best sign. But again, I think there's at least some potential for him in the game, especially after listening to him talk. So because of that, I'm higher than on him than I was before, but I can't put him too much higher. He's here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and these next two players are people I view pretty similarly in my opinion, and it's actually two of the younger people on the cast. But at number 14, we have Lydia, and like the people I just mentioned, Lydia also feels very high variance to me. On one hand, she is a super fan, and I have little doubt that she'll be aggressive within the game. I also enjoyed listening to her in her interview as she seemed good socially, and I also think Vadi is a somewhat decent fit for her, and I can see her connecting with Chanelle and Hai. I would say, compared to Daniel, I have less confidence in her being an early boot than Daniel, but I also think that she's very young at only 22. And while she recognizes the need to play this little sister role, I don't know how that's going to fly on a tribe like this where there is plenty of older people on the tribe as well. And I think with people like Hai and Chanelle on her tribe, I think there is potential that she could still be an early boot as a result. Like I said, she is less likely to be an early boot than Daniel is. However, there is still that potential for her with her being perceived as this hyper strategic, super fan that's pretty young, and I worry that that could cause her to get targeted. Also, again, the fact that she is so young is a bit of concern on its own. So because of that, I have her here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and we have someone pretty similar to Lydia, in my opinion, as it's sort of weird because on one hand, I think this person has less potential to win the game, even if they got to the end, than Lydia. However, I think they also have more potential to make it further in the game and less potential to be an early boot. And here we have Swati. And Swati is interesting. She's the youngest person on the cast, only 19 years old. And on paper, she has quite a bit going for her. I mean, she's an Ivy League student. Like she is someone who enlisted in the National Guard. She talks about prioritizing service, and there's quite a bit going on with her. And again, she's a super fan as well. Like she definitely knows the game, much like Lydia does. However, I think there are some red flags as well, mainly ones that came out in her interview with RJP. In there, like there's a moment where she's asked how she thinks she might be perceived on the island, and she said that she couldn't really tell how she could be perceived, that it really would have to depend on how things are when she got out there. And for me, that really signaled her lack of life experience, in my opinion, where she doesn't seem to have enough self awareness to have a sense of how she might be perceived when she's out there. And I think in general, her biggest issue, in my opinion, is the fact that she's so young. She reminds me a lot of Liana in a way, where again, like she's pretty young, and while she does have some life experience with her being in the National Guard, again, she's still in college. Like she's still someone who is going to be on a tribe and a cast full of older people. And it's just a matter of if she can garner the respect to not only gain some control and get some of these people to do what she wants, but even if she gets to the end, if she's able to garner that respect or not. And it's going to be pretty hard for her, in my opinion. Now, again, the reason I have her above Lydia is because I think she has less potential to be an early boot. I think she's gotten a pretty good fit for a starting tribe, and I wouldn't be surprised if she makes the merge, in my opinion. However, it's just the fact that she's so young and she seems to have some holes in how she sees herself, how she thinks other people are going to be, and some definitely some issues in terms of self awareness. So I think those are all things that are going to play into her performance in the game. It's going to be hard for her to sort of come in and dominate despite being someone who's a fan and knows the strategy of the game really pretty well. So because of that, I have to leave her here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and I debated over putting these next two people lower as I could see them being early boots as well. However, I think there's a bit more going on for them there to where I have at least some confidence that they could skate by. But here at number 12, we have Lindsey, and Lindsey was definitely one I went back and forth on. I mean, she definitely jumps off the page personality wise. I mean, reading her answers reminded me a lot of Sydney, although it's hard to tell just from reading whether this is a good type of quirky or a bad type. And she definitely shows off some game knowledge with her stressing the importance of the social game and claiming she has the ability to outwit everyone. Even so, she's very talkative and a bit in the forefront, which I don't think is great for her long term prospects. But what separates her from the people we talked about earlier is that I think if she's able to get people on her side, she'll probably be the leader of her alliance. However, she also has the potential downside of getting on people's nerves or getting into a turf war with Jonathan, as she does talk a bit about wanting to be the leader, which is something, but there is potential for her being an early boot as well. Although I will say there's also potential for her being like a Nora figure from Island of the Idols, where again, she kind of annoys people, is sort of on the outs for a lot of the game, and by the end, it's just kind of dragged to the end as a goat. So I feel like Lindsey is someone that can go in all types of directions, in my opinion, and it's just that uncertainty that makes me not put her too high. However, I think there's enough potential there to where I could put her here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and we have someone who's kind of similar to Lindsey in some ways, but is also kind of different. And here we have Tori, and Tori's interesting because she does have experience on social strategy games, particularly through Sequester. And she plays relatively well from what I heard, making it to the final six. But admittedly, I never watched it and don't know how she got to the final six, so it's sort of hard to really assess that. But looking at everything else, she seems on paper to be a pretty well-rounded player, good physically, so good socially, good strategically. I like her talking about Ken Spradlin and can see a world where she embodies that mold. Although I'm not sure whether this cast will allow that type of person to dominate the game. And another thing about her is I feel like she has a lot of potential to be perceived as a threat early on, where, like she talks a lot in her interview about how she's someone who has studied a lot for the game. She studies psychology, and she talked a lot about how she's been cultivating this way to make herself like this great person on first impression. Like she studied the perfect first impression. And to me, yes, that's good in the sense that she understands that aspect of it, things. However, I worry that she may come off as a bit too calculating. And again, while I can't guarantee that many people on this cast have seen Sequester, if there is, then that's probably something that's going to put her in danger. And again, I could very well see her being perceived as this strategic threat early on, where people see how likable she is or how much she's working the game, and through that be set up as a potential blindside early on. So again, there are all sorts of mixed signals coming from me from Tori, where I think on paper she's a great candidate. However, there's this inkling thought in the back of my head that she could still be targeted early on. That's not particularly great. There's also the sense that she could come off as too calculating. That's not great either. So because of that, I feel like 11 is about as high as you can put her. Now we're moving on to number 10, and honestly, I still don't know what to think of this person. And here we have Romeo, and first of all, again, the fact that we have a contestant named Romeo on Survivor is something to say the least, but honestly, like when reading his bio and like seeing all the stuff from him, I'm pretty mixed on Romeo, if I'm honest. Like, because on one hand, he is a super fan. He's not too young. Like I feel like he is a fairly well-rounded player on the whole. I mean, he's watched the show. I feel like he has a somewhat decent occupation to where he's a pageant coach, and that's definitely something that I think could translate to Survivor to a degree. However, there are some reservations I have, namely, like, I don't feel like he gives off too much about what he'll do strategically in the game or how he'll come off. And I don't, like, I know other people have talked about this. I don't love his answer about what player he'll be like. He says, I don't think anyone has played a game like me or the one I will play. And it's like, come on, give an answer. And I also think it was interesting listening to RJP's interview about Romeo, how they talked about how Romeo and Zach are fighting for the same spot on the tribe. And I feel like that'll be an interesting battle to see play out. Now, honestly, if that's how the dynamic will play out, I think Zach may edge it out over Romeo. And through that, Romeo could be an early boot as a result. However, I feel like Romeo is such a mixed bag for me, where I feel like there aren't too many things that I can really discredit against him. Well, maybe aside from that answer he gave. But however, there also aren't a ton of positives I can give either, really, aside from his age and his occupation, and also the fact that he has watched Survivor before. So he's not someone I feel too much either way on. So I feel like it's sort of fitting that he's here in the middle of the list, and he's here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have someone who I'm a bit more positive on, but again, I'm not too sure about them. And here we have Maryanne, and Maryanne's interesting. I mean, she is on the younger side. She's only 24. However, I do like some of her answers she gives. Like, she is a super fan. I mean, I know a lot of people are big super fans, but still, there's the fact that she talks about Davy a lot, and how Davy was someone who was loyal to many people, had a strong core alliance, and was social. And, you could take or leave the loyalty part, but she does talk a lot about the social game and how she is someone who will do well socially. And I feel like that is the right mindset to go into this season. I also like the fact that, she is a seminary student, sort of like Shan to a degree. Now, I'm not too sure whether she'll actually be like Shan at the end of the day, as again, she is a bit younger than that. However, I think, again, when you're comparing yourself to Davy and Shan, then I think you're definitely on the right track there. Again, Maryanne is someone who I think could fly under the radar for a decent amount of the game without jumping out as too big of a threat. And I think that's enough there to have her as high as she is on the list. However, again, she is someone who I still don't have too much to say on at the end of the day. However, I think she is someone who could do well in the game. So because of that, I have her here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we have another pretty interesting person to talk about. And here we have Roxroy. And again, we're having contestants named Roxroy on Survivor now, but I'm actually feeling okay about him. Now, his bio is probably the shortest out of anyone here, and in his interview, he definitely speaks the most like a normal person, I feel like, where he openly admits that he's mostly there for the money. And again, he just seems like a normal person for the most part. But he is someone who, again, still has watched the show. He is someone who talks about Cochrane and how he understood his weakness the second time and strengthened him to compete and win. And he talks about how he's not going to forget what he's playing for. And I feel like there is sort of a charm that comes through that. I feel like Roxway will be someone who can bond well on his tribe to where I don't really see him being much of an early boot. However, the big question for me is how strategic will he be? And while he is someone who has watched the show, I'm not too sure how strong he'll be strategically. I feel like that's something we'll really have to see once we get onto the island. However, if he does have the strategy behind him, then I think he definitely will be able to build enough bonds, get his numbers, and then really do well in the game. However, I feel like there are other people that I'm a bit more confident on. So because of that, I had to leave him here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and I can see this person being a bit too high, as this person definitely has some variance with their game. However, I feel relatively good about Zach. And again, Zach's interesting. He's clearly one of these younger super fans that's probably very strong strategically. And it's great that he acknowledges the fact that he is so young and can be perceived as not having a ton of life experience. Although a lot of his accomplishments are centered around school and extracurriculars, which probably isn't the best sign. Now, I do like him for what he represents and hopes that he does well, although people in his archetype haven't been overly successful. I mean, the first person that comes to mind for me is Adam Klein, who, despite winning a season, was prone to playing too hard at points and not having the best social bonds. And I could see that same trajectory happening for Zach. However, I feel like, again, like they mentioned in the RHAP interview, that one of the possible dynamics would be Romeo and Zach fighting for that spot on their tribe as being this, young, hyper strategic person. And I could see Zach winning that battle at the end of the days to where I don't think Zach could be the first boot. I mean, he could. However, if he isn't and survives over Romeo, then I think that's definitely something that can play to his favor. And again, I feel like similar to Adam, he is someone who will probably fight hard for a lot of the game. He's someone who can definitely connect with a lot of these younger, hyper strategic people on the game. Mind you, those people aren't as prevalent on Ika as some of the other tribes. And I feel like if he's able to make the merge, then I think he could do relatively well. Again, I could see people saying that he should be lower on the list, and I'm honestly questioning whether he should be lower on the list as well. But considering the fact that there's plenty of people on this list who either have some big flaws with their game or are people who I'm just not too sure about, I feel like 7 is kind of good enough for him, but we'll definitely check in once the actual season starts. Now we're moving on to number 6, and I think these next 3 people are all kind of in a similar tier as they're all relatively older people and people that I think could struggle to get towards the very end. However, I think they are in a decent position to be on strong positions in the pre-merge. But at number 6, we have Drea, and Drea's a bit interesting as again, she's someone who talks a lot about being a fitness consultant and how they've had to sacrifice sweat and like really work hard to succeed. And the thing that I like about her is the fact that she is someone I think she could be a leader for her tribe. I mean, she definitely does fit this mold of someone who is a bit of a go-getter, someone who is a bit more out in front. And unlike some people we talked about earlier, like Lindsey, I feel like people could actually respect Drea and really connect with her well. And I think Drea can be quite effective at that. Plus, I think there are people on her tribe that will probably latch onto her, at least in the pre-merge. And obviously I say that, and maybe that's not the best sign in the world, but I feel like Drea has a lot of potential to get through the pre-merge in relatively good condition. And beyond the merge, I feel like again she could be in the majority alliance. I could see that happening. It's just a matter of if she can get to the very end, and it's sort of hard for me to say that at the time being. I mean, I'm not too sure how effective she'll be strategically. However, I think she's good enough physically, not so much as she's a threat, but she's good enough physically to where people respect her. And I think she's also good enough socially to where she'll build bonds with a lot of the younger people on her tribe to where she'll probably be effective in that regard, or at least have people willing to hide behind her for a bit during the pre merge. And even if she is targeted, she could probably do well from that point on. I think there is some upside to Drea's game. However, it's just a matter of whether she can get to the very end, and we'll have to see, but I'm not feeling too confident for the time being. So I have her here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and we have someone who I think kind of similar about than Drea in the sense that I feel like they'll be good enough socially to build bonds and get towards the merge. However, I feel like this person is probably less likely to be targeted due to being a leader figure. And here we have Mariah, and again, she's a bit of an older person. She's 47, and she's a stay-at-home mom. She talks a lot about her life experience. She talks about how she lost her brother, due to COVID last year, and obviously those were all big things for her. Now she talks about her game being a mix of Angelina and Tony, which is a bit of a combination if you ask me. But I think what really draws me towards Mariah is her ability to build bonds. I think she'll be pretty effective socially, and I think people will be willing to stick around with her for a decent amount of the game. Now, admittedly, I think where she could stumble is strategically. I mean, she does talk a lot about her experiences in life, which leads me to believe that she could be viewing a lot of this as an experience more so than a game, sort of like a Jenny to a degree, which probably isn't the best sign in the world. However, I feel like Mariah is still someone who would probably be good enough socially to where people will want to keep her around. And I feel like if she is able to get to the merge, then she could definitely turn it up strategically. I think she is someone who, despite talking a lot about, like her life and how this game is an experience, she probably is someone who has still watched the show quite a bit and knows the strategy of the game and probably realizes that, like she will need to turn it up at some point. So I think there's definitely some credit that you can give her. Now, obviously, with someone like her as being an older figure and someone who could probably emerge as this mother type figure, there obviously is the risk of playing aggressively as most people would. But obviously, if you fit that archetype, then you run the risk of people feeling betrayed, and in turn, people feeling less likely to give you their jury vote, even if you got to the end. So there is that bit of a risk with Mariah, but I still feel like she'll be good enough socially to get through those early rounds. And I feel like she is someone who can definitely navigate the game strategically, even if she does talk a lot about her life experience through her interviews. So I think that's definitely something going in her favor. And because of that, I decided to put her here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4. And again, we're sticking with this grouping of older players who I think could do relatively well. And here we have Mike. And I really like Mike, both reading his bio and listening to his interview, where he definitely talks a lot about his rough upbringing, like living in, like a rough urban neighborhood, becoming a firefighter and being a fan of the show from day one. Now, he does talk about wanting to play like Boston Rob, but isn't sure if it'll work out that way. And I feel good about Mike. I think he'll definitely charm a lot of people socially. I think he will come to be perceived as a natural leader for his tribe, which I think is probably a good thing. Like even though he isn't, may not be entirely willing to take that on. And I think he could still be someone who, despite being perceived as his leader figure, isn't really targeted. Now, there could be some downside with him, like especially if he does play too slow. But I think he is someone who probably will play a bit more aggressively if he is willing to mention people like Boston Rob in his interview, and even people like Tony. So I think there's definitely a lot of upside for Mike in the game. However, I feel like the 3 people we'll be talking about are all people I feel like are more conventional winner picks in my view. And I feel like while Mike has a lot of potential in the game, I feel like these 3 people edge him out to a degree. So because of that, I had to leave him here at number 4. All right, now we're moving on to the top 3. And like I said, I feel like this top 3 is somewhat definitive. I feel like these 3 are probably the most conventional winner picks in my view. And while that's certainly not a guarantee that these people will do relatively well, I feel like there's enough there, especially with how uncertain the rest of this cast feels for the time being. But at number 3, I decided to go with Chanelle. And I like Chanelle a lot. She mentions being a super fan, and I feel like she works in a field that's useful for Survivor, with her being a recruiter. I assume she knows how to influence people, or at least certain types of people, to do what she wants. And to me, she gives me similar vibes to Liana, only she's a bit older, has more life experience, and can probably act more calculated. I feel like she's someone who probably will play more self interestedly than someone like Liana. And after reading her Bloom interview, I'm feeling even more confident about her. I like her answer about how life in general mirrors Survivor and how the need to build strategic relationships is relevant. I think she'll be someone that'll adapt well to the game and build those relationships. Now, I could see her being targeted later on in the game, especially if she comes out too far in front. However, I assume she's someone that will be aware of that, and I feel like she has a decent shot at making the merge, in my opinion. In general, she's someone I'm very high on, and I feel like she has a lot of potential to do well, or at least based on these preseason interviews. So, because of that, I have her here at number three. Now we're moving on to number two, and we have a very interesting person to talk about. And this person has been a lot of the promos. And here we have Omar, and I like Omar a lot as well. I mean, he definitely talks well in the interviews. He definitely has a very interesting background of being one of the few Canadians on the cast, but also being a Muslim and also being someone who works in an interesting field as an exotic veterinarian. So I think that's all pretty cool stuff. And just listening to him, he reminds me a lot of people who have done well in more recent seasons. So people like David Wright, for example, like he's definitely on the quirkier side, and he's definitely someone that recognizes his perception pretty well, and I think he'll definitely play into that quite a bit. He is someone who probably will be underestimated to a degree, although I think something that could definitely harm him is the fact that people like him have played before, and through that, people might be more aware of that type of player and could possibly snipe him out earlier. But I think just on paper, he is someone who I think will do relatively well, someone I think will connect well with a lot of people, and someone who I think understands the strategy well enough to where he probably will know when to strike and how to manage his threat level during the pre-merge. I think there's quite a bit going on for him. And something else I should mention is that he is on a decent starting tribe. I can't see him being the first boot off that tribe. So I think that's definitely something that'll also play to his favor as well. But I feel like there's one other person I think has the potential to do as well as him strategically, but maybe doesn't have the downside of being similar to these other types of players that might be a bit of a fish out of water at first, but then jump out to be this big character. I feel like that's enough to leave him here at number two. And now at number one, my winner pick for Survivor 42 is High. And I know plenty of other people have talked pretty highly about High, and there's good reason to. I mean, he comes off very well in these interviews. I mean, he similar to Shane from 41, he had a rough upbringing. He immigrated, he grew up in poverty, he was a latchkey kid, which makes me think he has a decent amount of life experience and will probably be pretty good socially. He seems pretty good strategically as well, but not outwardly to the point where he'll be targeted early. In reading his Mike Bloom interview, we know he's a super fan. He has pretty good knowledge of the game. I like how his answer about he's open to working with anyone. It just depends on who he shares values with. I also like his answer about wanting to listen to people more. And there's just a lot of great answers that he gives off in his interview. And through that, I feel like he has a lot of potential in the game to connect well socially, to be pretty good strategically, but not have that downside of being perceived as his figure who might be too likable by the end of the day. I feel like he is someone who can come in and do pretty well without being targeted. Now, the one potential downside I could see with him is that he could end up fitting into this archetype of being the quote unquote next Yule, sort of like a James Lim from Ghost Island, who was pretty good as a pretty good player strategically, but wasn't good enough socially to avoid being targeted pre-merge. And I could see that a world where that happens to High as well. But honestly, I just have a lot of confidence in High socially to where he can build those bonds and avoid that situation. I also think he's getting into a pretty good starting tribe where he's unlikely to be the first boot from that tribe, and I feel like he will be able to connect with a decent amount of people on the tribe. He's not too young, he's not too old. He can definitely connect well with just about everyone in that tribe to where I think he will definitely come into the merge pretty well suited for the end game. I feel pretty good about his ability to get far in the game. And again, I know other people have talked his praises at this point, and I know I'm not the only person considering him my winner pick, but I feel like just looking at everyone else, he's the one person I feel the most certain about, or at least based on this preseason. But I know a lot of these will change once the actual season starts, once we see how the show's being edited. So because of that, I have High as my winner pick for Survivor 42. And there we go. That will do it for this preseason power ranking. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And like I said, I'm going to be covering Survivor 42. I'm probably going to be releasing these power rankings on Friday, so the day after the episode. So stay tuned for that. Obviously, I'm still covering Australian Survivor. So that's a big thing going on, doing power rankings for that as well. Big Brother Canada is now in full swing. So stay excited for those power rankings. There's a lot going on and the train just isn't really stopping. So I'm really looking forward to making more of this content. So stay tuned for that. But for now, that is the video. See ya.